Okay, welcome everybody. We will get started. So we've got a special guest come along with us today. So this is Deacon Olek. I think most of you have met him before, so you can make him feel welcome. He is someone that has studied philosophy extensively. So he's just popping in today to give us a bit of a lesson on virtue ethics. So just to put that in the frame of where we're at the moment, we've done 2 ethical frameworks so far, okay? So yesterday we did utilitarianism, all right? And so that is an ethical framework that is all about the outcome, okay? We can do anything to get there as long as the outcome is good, okay? And then we looked at sort of the inverse of that. So we looked at deontology, the categorical imperative, and that was, it's all about acts themselves, okay? The acts have to be good. It doesn't matter what the consequences are, as long as the acts themselves are good. So that being the sort of key difference between them. And it was really interesting because going around the classroom, we had a number of people that were like, I feel better about utilitarianism, and I feel better about deontology. So can you just raise your hand for me? Who felt better about utilitarianism? Who felt more drawn to that? Okay, excellent. And the deontologist, can you raise your hand? Excellent. There's a pretty even split, I thought, just going around, so that's really good. Anyway, I will pass over to Deacon Olek. He may introduce himself a bit, and we'll get into our lesson on virtue ethics. So thank you.
Great. No, thanks, Mr. Rose. I'm Deacon Olek, and it's a pleasure to be here. Love philosophy since I was young. Love reading it, arguing, playing with ideas and concepts, and ethics in particular is probably the main strand of philosophy that's in the world today. Most of the philosophical questions we ask, whether it's in government, medicine, school and education, most of them are ethical questions. You hear the word ethos, we talk about the ethos of schools, of hospitals, of government. That's drawing from ethics. And ethics is primarily about, more generally speaking, about 3 things: the good, the right, and the ought. But we'll get that into a bit later. And so today, like Mr. Rose was saying, we've looked at utilitarianism, deontology, and the third main framework of ethics today. Can you guess what it is? Virtue. Very good. Virtue ethics. And I've got a quote there from Shakespeare: to be or not to be. Now, hopefully by the end of the class, you'll know why that quote is on there with regard to virtue ethics. So we've got utilitarianism ends, deontology is about the action, and the virtue ethics, what do you think that's going to be about? Just to get you start thinking, before we look at virtue ethics, what do you think virtue ethics is going to be about?
Good actions for good ends.
Say it again, sorry.
Good actions for good ends.
Close. So, because that's good actions is more so deontology, ends is utilitarianism, and character or person, it's person focused. So we describe certain people as that guy's a good guy. He's kind, he's courageous, he's humble. That's the realm of virtue ethics that we're looking at, right? So ethics is about 3 things: the good, the thing desired, the ideal. So that's in particular with utilitarianism, the end, the good, what are we working for? Right, the opposite of wrong as defined by some law. And ought, personal obligation, duty, responsibility. Of the 3, which one do you think fits deontology the most? Right, yeah. Right and maybe ought. The categorical imperative speaks of duty and responsibility. So that's ethics more generally. Now, what are the questions that ethics ask? This is a good image that I find to help me think of ethics generally. So imagine there's a fleet of ships and they're all oriented to an island, right? So you have 3 aspects in that journey that looks at ethics. So 3 questions that must be asked if a fleet of ships is going to get to a destination. First is each individual ship well structured? can it float? Does it work? That's individual ethics, right? So it's each individual ship, is it well functioning? Individual ethics. Second, is the relationship between the ships okay? Are they all oriented in the same direction? Because if you had two at right angles, there's going to be some problems there, isn't there? Social ethics. It's a relationship between people. Third, the most important question is, what's the end? What is the island that we're striving for? Because if we got the wrong end, it doesn't matter if we're good, if each ship is good and the relationship between the ships is good, because you're going to end up in the wrong place. So teleology, have you heard that word before? Teleology. It comes from a Greek word telos, meaning end. What is the end goal? What is the end game that we're focused to? So there are three questions. Individual ethics. Think of the ship. Is each ship well functioning? Second, the relationship between the ships in the fleet. Social ethics. Third, what is the destination? Teleology. Does that make sense? Any questions? And as I'm talking, if you've got any questions or comments, please shout out. So, we're going now to the three main forms: utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics. Utilitarianism, focus on consequences, outcome-based. Deontology, focusing on rules, agent-based. Virtue focuses on moral character-based. So as we move to the first two, to the third, we shift from law to a person. So like I said, we describe people mainly through virtues. If you look at your friends or people you admire, you generally don't say, I like that person because they follow such and such a rule. Or I like that person because they give me good outcomes in my life. We generally describe our friends and people we admire through the virtues they have. I like that person because... Any examples of virtues that you can think of? Think of your own friends or people you admire. What are some of the aspects of their character that you admire? I'll start us off. Humility. Any others? Character traits that we like in others, admire. Intelligence. Kindness.
Honesty.
I think Ashley said honesty.
Honesty. Very good.
She just lied to me when she said nothing.
Yeah. Honesty. So when we describe our friends or people we admire, we're in the realm of virtue ethics. We move from law to person. It's character. So what kind of character do we have versus the rules we obey? It's rather being. What kind of person are you, than what kind of actions that you do. And it doesn't mean that virtue ethics isn't concerned with rules or it isn't concerned with law, but the focus and the fundamental basis of the system is virtue rather than rules or ends, as deontology and utilitarianism. So just knowing a bit about virtue ethics, do you think, the bottom question, is virtue ethics about the good, the right, or the ought? Ought? Why?
Because the ought is about the person, about what they do and their involvement.
Would that be more deontology though, do you think?
Deontology would definitely fit into it, but I feel like it fits virtue ethics better, seeing it's specified about the person.
The person. Do you think the good though? Because we describe people as good people,
yeah,
rather than in virtue ethics by the character they have, rather than what they should do. So virtue ethics would focus, I think, more on good as a character trait, rather than what they should be doing for either ends or rules and laws. Yeah. So it's more like person-based rather than being rather than doing, because ought has to do more with action, what you ought to do. You don't really say you ought to be such and such a person. Yes, that's part of it, but the focus is on being rather than doing. So the doing kind of flows from the being. What is a virtue? So the idea of virtue really came from the ancient Greeks. Do we know any ancient Greek philosophers? Socrates, yeah, very good. Who was his student? Starts with P. Plato, very good. And the third, his student? Aristotle, very good. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they had a big focus on virtue. So Socrates didn't write out anything. Plato wrote what we call the dialogues. And there's about 30 dialogues, and every single dialogue is on a different virtue. So this was the world of the Greeks. It was about how to be a good person. This was the fundamental question for them. Virtue, and it was about the good life. I think there was a show on Netflix recently, The Good Life. But this is coming back, this question of the good life is coming back into society. People are asking, what does the good life look like? And it's a question then of virtue. Because virtue is an excellent, it's a trait of character. It's a character that describes the good person who lives the good life. A virtue is a habitual and firm disposition to do the good. So that's that focus on the good as opposed to right or ought. To possess a virtue is to be a certain sort of person with a certain complex mindset. And it's a mean between two extremes. The virtuous thing to do in a given situation is neither too much nor too little. It is appropriate, not modest. So that's some kind of base definitions of what virtue is. Any questions on any of those ideas? So virtue is basically a firm disposition towards the good. So if we describe someone as a kind person, that means they have a firm disposition to do kind things. It's natural to them. Virtue is like a second nature because they're so accustomed to acting in a particular way that they've shaped themselves in that direction. Good analogy is with sport. So if we say someone's a good soccer player, what does that mean? They've got a firm disposition to the excellence of playing soccer. They control the ball well, they've got a good strike, they're fit, they pass well. That's, they're good soccer players. But then, what does it mean to be a good person more generally? And that's a more fundamental question. Well, good people are characterised by, they're virtuous. So we would say they're kind, they're humble, and all those other virtues we mentioned before. So it's a firm disposition to act in a particular way. Does that make sense? So it's like another definition, easy definition of virtue is second nature. We say it's second nature to someone to do something because they've done it so often that they've shaped their character in that particular way. Is that okay? Yep. So these, like I mentioned before, the Greeks thought and talked more than anyone else. Generally, like they love talking. And the main topic of their discussion was virtue. So like I said, it was the question of the good life was fundamental. And then how do you live a good life? The next question is virtue, by being virtuous. How do you be virtuous? By acting virtuously, which shapes your character as a virtuous person. So that's the kind of step process that they went through. Now this will go back to your bit about your logic in terms of arguments. So Socrates was the first person really that we have in this, one of the main real fundamental people with regard to virtue, and him seeing the importance of virtue. So point 1, does someone want to read, can everyone see that? Does someone want to read point 1 out?
We always seek our own good and not our own harm. We always seek happiness.
Yep. Point 1. Someone read point 2.
If you know yourself, then you know that the self is the soul of your own true good, is the good of your soul.
Very good. Point 3.
If you know your soul well enough, then know that virtue is the only way to happiness, because virtue is the health of the soul.
Very good. And then the italics.
If we know these three things and do not doubt them, we will always do good and not evil.
Very good. So that's, if you remember from logic, that's the syllogism. So, first point, we want good and not evil, right? You know, that's what we all seek. We all seek happiness. That's the first point. Second point, if you know your own self, well, what is happiness? It's the true good of your soul. And virtue is the health of the soul. So if we know these things, we should be happy. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What points do you think are right? Do you think the argument flows well? Is the conclusion correct? That if we are virtuous, we are happy? Let's break it down. Point 1. Do we all seek happiness? Yes or no? Hands. Who thinks we all seek happiness? Who thinks we don't? Good. So we don't seek happiness?
My only problem with this is always seek happiness.
We only sometimes seek happiness.
I believe it's more it's mostly human beings are mostly in search of happiness, but there are specific dispositions or times where happiness is not to be sought.
It's kind of seeking something what you need versus what will make you happy.
Yeah.
But then why do you seek what you need? If we take that argument further, can you give an example of seeking something you need that isn't happiness?
If you're stuck somewhere and you only have say you hate tuna, right? But you only have a can of tuna to eat, then you might not be happy to eat the can of tuna, but you have to eat it, otherwise you're going to die of starvation. As an example, that's very far-fetched example.
So your desire to survive trumps the dissatisfaction to eat the thing. Why do you want to survive?
Yeah, you can survive probably to be happy if you do really have.
So maybe it's actually better. It'd probably be we ultimately seek happiness. So happiness is always the end point of everything we do.
Yeah.
So there's a story. Actually, my godfather told me this story. It's anecdotal, but I think it kind of goes to this point. There's a guy fishing on a boat, and he just spends his day fishing. And a wealthy businessman comes up to him and says, "Oh, why don't you start a business that fishes? You can get more fish rather than just sitting here and one at a time." And he says, and the fisherman asks, "Why?" And the businessman says, "You can start a company, get some employees, and then manage them to get more fish, and you'll get more bang for your buck." And he asks, "Why?" "Well, then you have more," and the businessman goes, "Well, then you have more money, you can buy a house." And then the businessman asks, "Why?" "Well, you'll be wealthy, you'll be honoured by your friends, you have a high status in society and be respected." And then he says, "But why do I want that?" And then the businessman goes, "Well, so that you can be happy." And then the fisherman says, "Yeah, but I already am." So that's a little kind of anecdote about everything we do in life. If we take the argument to the nth degree, it's ultimately to be happy. Does that make sense? So happiness is the end of all of our actions. This is Socrates' argument. That's a good. I think we ultimately seek happiness. I think happiness is the end, so that the different actions in between may be painful. We might be doing something that, we're sitting in class at the moment, right? It's good, but it can get boring, and it's not ultimately happiness right now. But why are we sitting here? Well, to get an education. Why do we want an education? To get a job and live a good life type thing. Why do we want that? To be happy. So each moment in the narrative of our lives may not be ultimate happiness, but the reason we do things is to seek happiness. Does that make sense? Am I going all right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
recess about 5 to 10 minutes.
So if you know yourself, then you know that the self is the soul and your own true good is the good of your soul. What do we think of that? So we've established that we ultimately all want happiness. Now he's shifting the argument to ourselves. Okay, what is happiness for me? He thinks it's the good of the soul. Who agrees with that statement? The happiness is the good of the soul. Who disagrees with it? Or who doesn't know? So it's a good question because happiness is the good of your soul. So what does Socrates mean there? He thinks that the soul is the deepest identity of who the human person is. That it's the fundamental principle of life, that the soul is who we are. That as we grow, we change, but our identity, physically we change, and so our appearance changes. So our appearance isn't the fundamental identity of who we are. He thinks it's the soul that kind of, through our life, remains constant. And when we talk today of identity, that's what Socrates means by the soul. So we could translate that today as happiness is the what is good for who we are, or it's good for our own identity. Does that make sense? This is the world that Socrates. So happiness is the good of my person, of who I am. Who would agree with that? If rephrasing it that way. Who disagrees with it? Who would like to make a comment on that? Yes?
The thing about the second one with the way you reworded it is it seems very individual based.
Yeah.
Not like when happiness could be seen also as a societal thing, and the good or the knowing oneself and knowing that the true good is the good of your soul, although that is true for oneself. What about true for others' selves? The happiness of your actions and your good may be the sadness of their soul.
That's a very good point, and that's one of the critiques of virtue ethics, that people can see it as individualistic. And going back to the image of the ships, it's the functioning of an individual ship is the most important. But a good counter kind of argument is, if I am a virtuous person, or my soul is good, does that mean I'm kind, humble, compassionate, and all these other things which are socially related? Because if I'm a good person, say I'm compassionate, or you describe someone as a good person, they're compassionate. That's a good influence on the rest of society, isn't it? So but it is a very good point that it can be read as individualistic. I care only about myself. So keep that in the back of your mind as well. So established, we all want happiness ultimately. Happiness is the good of the soul. Point number 3. If you know your soul well enough, then you know that virtue is the only way to happiness, because virtue is the health of the soul. Does everyone understand that point? Who agrees with that point? That if we follow the argument, we all want happiness. Happiness is the goodness of the soul. Then the next question, how do we attain that? Through virtue.
So I'm saying, if we act virtuously, we will be happy. In its most simple.
Yeah. Very good. Does everyone agree with that? Yep. Who doesn't?
I can't agree with that myself, because there's too many external circumstances which may arrive where no matter how virtuous you are, something bad may happen and you may not end up with a happy life or a good life.
Yes. So that was so I don't know if you know Socrates' story. So he ended up he became a martyr for philosophy. So he was criticised for corrupting the youth by his questioning, and then he had to drink hemlock. And his argument was that nothing external can influence my happiness. And this was this point of, it doesn't matter what happens to me externally, my happiness is my own responsibility. That doesn't matter what family I've been born into, what circumstances in my life I have, whether I'm wealthy, whether I'm poor. My happiness, if I act virtuously, then I'll be happy. But Aristotle then says later, the happy life has to incorporate base needs. I need a base level of education, of food, etc. But Socrates is more extreme, saying no, it doesn't matter what happens to me in my life, as long as in myself I maintain virtue, that's okay. So that's a very good point, though, that's a question Aristotle brings in to critique Socrates about external circumstances. And then in the italics, if we know these three things and do not doubt them, we will always do good and not evil. So if we've established, like Mr. Rowe says, if you're virtuous, you'll be happy. Socrates then makes the point, if we know that, then we will all be happy. Do you agree that if we knew that virtue leads to happiness, we will all be happy? If we all knew that, then we should all be happy? That's true? Do you think that's true or not? Who thinks it's true? Hands up. Who thinks it's not true? Yes. Anyone at the back maybe that wants to contribute to why they think it's not true? Alright. Why do you think it's not true?
I feel like we always have that sense of wanting something more. So we're all virtuous and we're all doing good. It'll eventually eliminate the want for something more. So we'll all get boring is the word. We'll all get bored of our lives. So we won't be as happy.
So do you think good? So based on what you said, do you think goodness is then on doing something, finding new things to do?
Yeah, it would be because nowadays we have bad things around. We can do good things to fix those bad things, and then it makes it good. But if there's nothing bad, then it eliminates that whole area of doing good things. So
do you need bad situations to do good things though?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah.
I had two separate points. One of mine was similar to his, and going off of what he said about needing bad to do good, it's like the concept of you can't have shadow without light. If there is light, if there is good, then even if we know that virtue leads to good, it does not mean we will act in virtue. The knowledge of virtue leading to happiness, knowledge does not always indicate action.
Yes.
And if there is good, if there is light, no matter how bright it is, there will always be some patch of dark, some patch of bad, so that light can exist in itself.
But the point about even if we know something doesn't imply action is the main critique for that last point historically, because yes, we all have an intellect, but what do we also all have? An instinct or will. So because that statement, if we know the three things and do not doubt them, then we will always do good and not evil. All we have to do is look at society and recognise that we're all not happy. And yet that seems like most people would have an understanding that virtue leads to happiness. But the reality is we don't. So knowledge is not enough. What Socrates is missing is the will. Because, even in our own lives, we have various contradictory intuitions. Should I go for a run? Or should I eat my chocolate brownie? Most of us would agree that going for a run is probably the more virtuous thing to do. But doesn't mean, we always go for the run. This is where the problem kind of arises in our lives, when we have contradictory things, tensions within us, and we have to choose one or the other, and knowledge is not enough. Does that make sense? So virtue is the health of the soul, but knowledge is not enough to be virtuous. This is where the point you're making about action, that there's got to be a deliberate choice to act in a particular way. Because I can know this all theoretically, but it doesn't mean I'm going to be virtuous. Someone doesn't have to know what we're studying right now, and they can be virtuous. Does that make sense? That the knowledge of it is important, but it's not enough. So the important in virtue ethics is the shaping of character, not just through not knowledge, but through action and choices. So that's Socrates' argument. So I think most of us agree if we're virtuous, then we'll be happy. Would we all agree with that? If you're virtuous, you will be happy. But knowing that is not enough to be happy. Yeah? So that was Socrates. We can pause there. We can pause there, yeah.
Does anyone have any questions at this stage? So what is the time? Is it
10:53.
10:53. Yeah, we can have an early sort of couple of minutes and then we'll catch up. All right, guys, we will resume. So a bit of harsh. We've just got a little bit more. We've got some questions to go through.
So we finished off with Socrates. If you're virtuous, then you'll be good, and therefore you'll be happy. So what was the possible problem? So it's question 3 in your books. What was the possible problem, do you think, with Socrates' argument? If we know that if you are virtuous, we will be happy, we should all be happy. What's the problem with that?
Having the knowledge doesn't always mean doing the action.
Very good. Knowledge does not imply action. So there's a question of the will, that we don't always do, well, what we want to do, really. So that was Socrates' argument, and the argument there at the bottom on the screen: virtue is knowledge, vice is ignorance. But that's the problem, that virtue is more than knowledge. So, if virtue is more than knowledge, how do we attain virtue? So, up on the screen there are four sources of knowledge. How do we attain, what virtue? So we attain virtue naturally. Part B, by teaching. 3, habit. 4, against nature. So this is actually question 4, and this is now we turn from Socrates to his student what's the name of Socrates' student? Plato. Very good. And then we'll go to Aristotle. So Plato asked this question of how we attain virtue. Is it natural? So think of, say we describe a kind person. Do you think they're naturally kind, that it's just in their blood? Do you think they're kind because they were taught kindness? Do you think they're kind because they've developed the habit of doing kind actions? Or are they kind because they've worked against their nature to be kind? What do we think? Think of your own. Think of one trait of yourself, one good trait about yourself. Do you think you've attained that trait naturally? By teaching, by habit, or with great difficulty you've worked against it? What are the thoughts? sorry?
All of the above.
All of the above. Do you think that the first and fourth, do you think they contradict each other?
No.
So if it is,
You may be naturally virtuous in one aspect, but invirtuous in another, and you can work against your nature to become virtuous in the one that you are not already.
very good, yeah, that's a good point. So different philosophers throughout history have proposed each of the four. Now, knowing Socrates' argument, if you are virtuous, then you'll be happy, and if you knew that, you would be happy. Which one do you think Socrates is arguing for? Teaching. Yeah. So because if you know it, then you'll be virtuous. So we're taught virtue, therefore we should be virtuous. Now, the first one, we attain virtue naturally, is this guy that you don't have to remember this, but he is French philosopher Rousseau, very influential into the French Revolution. He described that we're naturally good people, that we're naturally virtuous. And then if you look at the first and the fourth one, they're kind of in one aspect of it. Say we're talking about one virtue, that they are contradictory, but yeah, I take your point that in different virtues and different aspects you can hold the same. But say we're looking at one virtue, say courage. One person will say we're naturally courageous, or is it against nature that we're naturally cowardly, and therefore we have to work against nature to be to be courageous, sorry. Can you see that? Does that make sense? The first and the fourth. The first one is promoted by a guy called Rousseau. The last one is more modern thinking that we're naturally bad people and we have to work hard to be good people. So at the base of this question is, are we good or are we bad? Does that make sense? Because if we're good, virtue should come naturally, second nature. Whereas if we're bad, we tend towards vice, then it's with great effort that we attain virtue. So these are four different examples, and I want you to kind of think about it in your own lives and how you attain virtue in your own lives. Because yeah, I think you're right that I think we in our own lives, if we reflect honestly, I think all four take a part. Some virtues are very difficult for us, and it feels like we're working against ourselves to be virtuous. Other virtues, are more natural. We have to be taught some virtues that we don't know of, as we grow up, the intellectual virtues taught by education, and by habit, by doing it over and over again. That's how we kind of ingrain, like the analogy of the soccer player. He trains every day and grows in virtue. So all of the above take place in our lives. So question 4 of your books: can virtue be taught? And remember, who argued that virtue can be taught? If we knew that virtues made us happy, we would all be happy. What's the name of that philosopher that we looked at? Socrates. So he asked the question, can virtue be taught? And then flowing on from that, should schools be making their students not only smarter but better people? What do you think of that? Do you come to school just for intellectual formation, that you know A, B, C, you know your chemistry, you know your physics, you know your maths? Or do you want to come out of school and actually contributing to society, being kinder, compassionate, loving? What do you think? Do you think you come to school just for education, in intellectual education, or do you think you come here to be better people? Any comments on that? Do we come to school to be virtuous? Yeah? No? Who thinks yes? That we actually come to school to become better people, to be kinder, more compassionate, etc. Yes or no? Yeah? Who doesn't think so? Who thinks that virtue cannot be taught, that we shouldn't expect to be better people coming out of school? I'll leave with that question with you, and you can mull over that one and write down your responses. So that's Plato. So we move from Socrates to Plato and now to Aristotle. So if we go back, we saw Socrates and Plato think, that virtue can be taught. If we knew the virtue made us happy, we would be virtuous. Aristotle thinks, number 3, that we attain virtue by habit. And he talks about the golden mean. Have you guys heard of the golden mean in virtue? So when we talk about virtue is always the medium between two extremes. So if we look at the virtue of courage, courage is between recklessness, the extreme, and cowardliness, the deficiency. So all the virtues, all the natural virtues are in between two extremes. So look at some more examples here. So the golden mean, we have the deficiency, cowardliness. The golden mean, the virtues, courage, excessive rashness. The golden mean is temperance. Is that how it's spelled?
Yeah.
Temperance. And then deficiency, licentiousness. Do you know what that means?
I don't know what temperance means.
So temperance means in good measure, as it were. So it's like eating chocolate. You buy a block of chocolate. The temperate person would not eat the whole block. He might have, 3 or 4 pieces. He'd be temperate. He'd be modest or moderate in how much he ate. The licentious one, intemperance, is kind of nothing. The insensibility, he'd eat the whole block type thing. The golden mean, liberality, freedom. Deficiency is prodigality. It's another big. I shouldn't have put these big words there. So the middle word, is freedom. One is the excessive, is kind of the restraint of freedom, and the left is kind of way too much, that everything goes. So that's actually a good question for the current. I won't just maybe food for thought about the current context with different restrictions. Do you think it's too many restrictions, not enough restrictions? What would you do? What's the appropriate measure? So these are questions that all the state governments are thinking of right now with, lockdowns and restrictions, masks, all of this, the question of, so I was studying in Melbourne, and at the moment, a lot of my friends are there, and they've got, how many kilometres outside of your space from your home should you be able to go? Should it be 5 kilometres? Should it be 25, 50? It's a question of this. It's like, what's the moderate amount that's not too much, not too little? Does that make sense? So all of the virtues are in the mean between two extremes. This is what Aristotle develops. And he defines 4 cardinal. So cardinal is from a Latin word cardo, which means hinge. So these are the main virtues he found, which all the others are based. So prudence. Prudence means acting in the right way at the right time. Second is temperance, so moderation, everything in moderation. Justice and courage. So they're the 4 hinge ones. Now, just a side question. So if we're talking about the virtuous person and how these virtues apply to ourselves, and taking a bit of, have any of you studying psychology? Or not? A bit about psychology. So Freud, he speaks of the soul, 3 parts of the soul: the id, which is the base where all our instincts come from; the ego, which is that sense of I; and the superego, which is the it's his version of the conscience. So there are 3 dimensions of soul, and those 4 virtues can be applied to the 3 dimensions of the soul. So the id, that place of the drives, the instincts, we need to be temperate there. So that's going to the example of the block of chocolate. That, that desire for food and pleasure comes from the id in Freud's analysis. So we need moderation there. Not too much, but not too little. If we look at the super ego, look at the ego, the sense of I, we need courage. If we believe particular things, we need to put them into action courageously. Then the super ego, which is the society around us, and how that influences us, we need justice. We need prudence. So we need to be prudent in how we act in society around us. And then justice is the unifying principle that unites all the aspects of the soul together. So they're the 4 cardinal virtues for Aristotle, which apply to the self and shape the self. And this is Confucius. So we've looked at Socrates, Plato and Aristotle in the West. Now in the East, a main philosopher is Confucius. And this is a good kind of quote, I thought. If there is harmony in the heart, there will be harmony in the family. If there is harmony in the family, there will be harmony in the nation. If there is harmony in the nation, there will be harmony in the world. So that is kind of a similar way of saying what Socrates said. If I'm virtuous, I'll be happy. So Confucius is starting from the heart to the world. If my heart is in order, what Socrates calls the soul, if my soul is good, then I'll be happy and the world will be good. Confucius says if I have harmony in the heart, then the effect will ultimately be harmony in the world. Does that make sense? 2 ways of saying the same thing, really. Now, some problems with virtue ethics. So this is the last slide, I think. Yep. So we've touched upon a few already. It does seem to be slightly self-centered. So individualistic, it's about me and myself, whether I'm a good person. Although a counter-argument can be, if I am a good person, then that should reflect well on the society and my relationships around me. So I'll leave that one with you. Another thing is that doesn't give clear points of action. So, say in your own experience with your parents, mum or dad says, be a good person. Like, okay, what does that mean? How, it doesn't, how do I be a good person? It doesn't give us clear rules or laws of action. It can be vague sometimes. Yes, the golden mean gives us some understanding, but still, it can be quite relative, and because it's to each situation. In one situation, you might need to be more courageous than in another, or the courage evokes something else in different situations. So it's not very clear as kind of Kant's categorical imperative, and even utilitarianism. There's base principles there, but one of the shortcomings of virtue ethics is there's no law, or rule of action. And that's because it's a shift from law to person. It's a shift to the kind of person you are, rather than what kind of rules you follow. Does that make sense? So it can be harder to frame as a system. Any questions, comments on that? Yes?
With what was on the other slide about coming from the heart and going to harmony of the world, it does seem like a slippery slope fallacy.
Go on.
Because that fallacy states that by a single action, then this next thing will be assured, and then after that will be assured until it reaches either a single great good or a single great bad.
Exactly. Yeah. So it is more. It's not a strict. It's more poetic than philosophical, that statement, because you can shred it to pieces. But yeah, like it is. I mean, the way it is written, it's kind of an if-then argument, but it is. It doesn't necessarily hold, but it's a general sense that. It's similar to Socrates' argument. I think Socrates, and I think this is reflective between the West and the East, that the West is much more logical in its expression. We were talking about this during the break, much more syllogistic, whereas the East is not as kind of rigorous in its logical thought.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just a different way of arguing. So yeah, good point. Might finish there then.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Deacon Olek. So, round of applause.